Where to Find Them. A fan rewrite by Patrick Murphy. Based on original characters and ideas created by J.K. Rowling. Chapter 1. Welcome to New York City. The sun does its best to shine through the layer of wispy gray clouds spread across the sky, making the day just a bit brighter than it might otherwise have been. But it is still a cool morning in New York Harbor. Black smoke rises from the stokes of ships moving in and out of the harbor, from small, humble tugboats to gigantic freighters. To the east, the broad, unending ocean surface marks the gateway to the Atlantic, a dull blue under the morning sky. And to the west, in stark contrast, stands the imposing skyline of one of the greatest cities of all time. Skyscrapers stand tall and firm, holding up the hopes of an entire country, and at the threshold of this metropolis, Liberty stands, enlightening an entire world with the torch held proudly aloft in her right hand. The passengers aboard the Fort Elizabeth can be safely divided into two categories: those who remain inside their cabins, and those too excited to make port, to be anywhere but out on the deck, staring at the ever-growing skyline. It's mostly children that are out on deck, running around and playing games with each other, their frantic bodies generating more than enough heat to shield them from the brisk morning. Apart from them, there are a few grown men and women huddling close together along the edge of the ship, their long coats held firmly against their shivering chests and shoulders. The odd one out is a man sitting alone on a bench on deck. He doesn't shiver, and sits perfectly still as they approach Manhattan Island. The salty sea air grazes the surface of his face, his brown hair being pressed firmly into a cowlick. His narrow eyes, set close together, squint lightly to account for the wind. A prominent chin sticks out unashamedly from underneath his thin mouth. He is dressed in a dark blue traveling cloak, white shirt beneath a pale yellow vest, black pants, and light blue bow tie. Beside him there is a suitcase, no bigger than 3 feet by 2 feet, colored a vivid shade of indigo, and sealed by 2 golden locks on top. Deep, silent breaths pass in and out of his nostrils, his muscles relaxing with each exhalation. Nearly there. A pair of children runs by him, but he pays them little heed. Still, he notices something fall to the floor. Peering down, he sees a small, stuffed tiger, one clearly well-loved if the stains and rips are anything to go by. He reaches down and picks up the stuffed cat, calling out, "Oi, you!" with an obvious Northampton accent. Both children turn around, neither sure which one the man is addressing. Upon seeing the tiger in his hands, one of them, a girl with black hair, rushes over to him and takes it. "Thank you, sir," she says in a bashful voice, clutching the tiger to her chest. "No worries," he says cheerfully. "You like animals?" She nods. Good, he says, giving her a kind smile. "Personally, I love animals. Tiger's your favorite, then?" She nods again. "What's yours?" "Well, actually," he begins before his words are cut short by the loud trumpeting call of the ship's horn. All around them, passengers begin to pour out of their cabins, making a direct line for the ramp. The girl runs off with her friend into the growing throng, the man looking slightly taken aback. "Oh. Well, right then," he says, getting to his feet and grabbing the handle of his suitcase. In no particular hurry, he finds a spot in the middle of the crowd as the ramp is lowered onto the deck, and the excited people begin to disembark. Each one reports directly to a customs agent dressed in an Oxford blue uniform. The man finds his way to one of these agents, a tall, pale man looking utterly ready to go home before 10 a.m. In a totally unenthused voice, he asks the man, "Name?" "Newton Scamander," the man says, handing him his passport. The customs agent examines the passport and consults the passenger manifesto. Seemingly satisfied, he asks, "First trip to New York?" "Yes," Newt says with a nod. "Anything to declare?" "No," Newt shakes his head. "Any foreign plants or animals?" Giving a small laugh, Newt says, "Ha! None, no." The customs agent eyes Newt's indigo suitcase. "Mind opening that up for me, sir?" "Not at all," Newt says, setting the suitcase on the desk and turning it around. The customs agent casually flicks the golden locks open, raising the upper half of the suitcase. Inside, he sees a few books, 2 magnifying glasses, a pamphlet on New York City, several articles of clothing, and a long yellow and gray striped scarf. Seeing nothing of special interest inside, he closes the hatch, hands Newt back his passport, and says, "Welcome to New York," though no hint of genuine welcome shows in his voice. Nonetheless, Newt responds with a courteous, "Thank you, sir," and he takes back his passport and suitcase and proceeds to the exit. He keeps his eyes peeled as he scans the crowds of people rushing from one place to the next, a churning sea of bodies dressed in long coats and hats. Pushing his way through the mob, he catches sight of what he is looking for. Held over the crowds is a large white sign that reads in bold and black letters, "Newt Scamander." Newt wastes no time in making his way directly toward the sign. As he gets closer, he makes out the figure holding it, a short, older gentleman dressed in a gray cloak with black goatee and blue eyes guarded by fully round glasses. The gentleman catches sight of Newt and lowers his sign, giving the new arrival a warm smile. When the two finally meet, they each extend their right hands, grasping with a firm grip and pulling each other closer. "Welcome, welcome," the gentleman says in a light German accent, his voice just slightly wheezy. "It's good to see you, Hans," Newt says with a smile. "And good to finally be off the boat. I swear to you, I do far too much travelling." "Well, you've still got ways to go yet," Hans says. "Alabama's another few hundred miles south, I'm afraid." Don't remind me," Newt says, rolling his eyes. "But before I can go to Alabama, I have to get this registered," he says, holding up the suitcase. Hans' eyes move to the luggage, a twinkle of excitement showing in them. "Ah, that's it then." "This is everyone," Newt says proudly. "Well, almost everyone, that is," he says, placing his free hand over a pocket on the inside of his coat. "Oh, really?" Hans says, a mischievous curiosity in his tone. Later, Newt says with a wave of his hand. "Anyway, perhaps you'll be so kind as to show me to the Woolworth building?" "Right this way, my friend," Hans says, gesturing out into the bustling city streets. When Newt takes his first step out onto the street, it feels like stepping into a fast-flowing river. To his left and to his right, streams of people hustle by, keeping their faces and heads down, their eyes pointed straight ahead. Past the rush of humanity swirling before him, the roads are teeming with brightly colored yellow taxicabs and hundreds of other automobiles of every color. Street lamps, signs, hydrants, and other marvels of modern technology line the streets, turning Newt's head from one corner to the next. Newt turns his head upwards to stare at the towering buildings surrounding him on all sides. His initial sense of awe at the sheer size of the great city is cut short when Hans grabs him by the scruff of his hair and pulls his head back down. "Didn't you read my letter? What did I say about looking up?" "Oh, right, sorry," Newt says, suddenly noticing the dirty looks from passing city-goers. "Don't want to draw suspicion, eh?" "No, I just don't want you to look like a damn tourist," he says, patting his friend on the shoulder. "This way." They turn the corner, heading uptown. "So, how are things with you, Hans? Still studying one law?" Hans shakes his head. "Done studying. Finished up a couple of weeks ago. I'm looking into setting up my own practice somewhere in the city." "What about competition?" Newt asks. Hans scoffs. "What competition? There's not a single private one-maker in all of Manhattan. You have to go into Queens if your wand breaks or if it gets infested with chisperfles. And the sisters that own that one shop are... well, I don't mean to sound rude, but the quality of their work has really gone downhill since their mother passed away." "So you're going to set up your own shop then?" Newt asks. Hans shrugs. "If I can. There's this little shop on 23rd Street. I'm thinking of working out of the basement, maybe set up a secret passage in the adjacent alley. The only problem is I don't have enough money, and Gringotts has tightened the requirements for loans." "Oh, I didn't know Gringotts handled American money," Newt mentions curiously. "Of course," Hans says. "Gringotts has a monopoly on banking in all British territories, past and present." "You'll have to show me where it is at some point tomorrow before the train leaves," Newt says. "I still have to get all my galleons exchanged for draggots." Of course, Hans says, leading Newt across the street. "So, how's the book coming along?" "Ugh, don't even get me started," Newt says, half exhausted, half amused. "I haven't even started writing the book proper, but if my notes are any indication, it's going to be over 1,000 pages at least. The publishers are going to butcher it." "That long? Really?" Newt nods. "There's just so many animals, and so much to say about each one. Could fill an entire book on the 25 species of billywig alone." "And how many travelling companions are you up to at this point?" Hans asks, his eyes flickering to the case. "Last I heard, you had about 100 different creatures, and up to 400 at this point. Though most of the lot's just small things, doxies, fairies, chisperfles, billywigs, that sort of thing." Hans whistles. "No wonder Makusa wants you to register as a case at the National Security Office." Newt gives a small, mirthless chuckle. "And believe me, getting them to agree to even that was a delight. The US has by far the strictest laws when it comes to handling magical creatures. If it weren't for my old ministry contacts, I doubt we'd ever be allowed into the country." Hans sighs. I know. It's a shame, really. Just last week, some poor sod was arrested for breeding puffskeins in his basement. Puffskeins, can you believe it? Oh, well. I hear things supposedly get a little more lax the further you get from the capital. I've even heard it said that there are some communities in the south that keep clabberts as pets. It's true, Hans says, nodding. They are apparently very effective muggle detractors. Really? Newt says, his eyebrows raising slightly. I hadn't heard about that. Still walking, he reaches into his coat and takes out a brown book. He stops in the middle of the sidewalk and sets his case down at his feet, taking out a pen of yet another coat pocket. As he stands in place, many hurried bodies nearly collide with him, hurling back a few choice obscenities as they continue on their way. Hans pulls Newt to the wall of the building beside them. Newt, he says, you can't just stop like that in the middle of the sidewalk. Why not? Newt asks, jotting down a note in his book. Because everyone's trying to get somewhere. You just stop suddenly and like that, people are going to crash into you. Why don't they just look where they're going? Newt asks, feeling almost affronted. Hans rolls his eyes. People are watching where they're going. They're just moving too fast to stop in time. Well, perhaps they ought to slow down then, Newt suggests casually. This is New York City, Newt, Hans says. Nobody slows down for anything. Newt slides his pen and book back into his coat. Why do you use a muggle pen? Because a quill and ink are too cumbersome in the field, Newt says. Newt sees the Woolworth building several blocks before they make it to the entrance. Its height is unrivaled in all the city, dwarfing all of the other buildings that dare to stand in its shadow. It is a cathedral of commerce, a neo-Gothic monument built on hundreds of tons of concrete and steel. The building's status is emphasized by its light green crown pointing triumphantly skywards atop its frontage. The front doors remain perpetually open as people rush in and out, inadvertently holding the door for those behind them. When Newt and Hans approach the line of doors, Hans moves to the far left. A doorman dressed in black stands by the side of the revolving door, tipping his hat to the two men as they approach. Hans leans in close to the doorman and speaks in a soft voice so none of the other people entering and leaving the building hear him. "Which way to the 13th floor?" The doorman smiles and says, "This way, sir," and he gestures to go through the door. Before they enter, Hans says to Newt, "Go around 3 times before exiting." Newt nods his understanding, and the two men step into the moving circle of doors. After successfully making 3 revolutions, they step out into the foyer of the building. Where before there had been masses of busied city folks dressed in long coats, instead Newt sees men and women dressed in cloaks that drag just slightly behind them, and wearing tall, pointed hats. In general, they seem to move at a slightly slower pace, many of them reading the newspaper as they walk. The entrance hall gleams emerald in the faint rays of the morning sunlight passing through the elongate windows running up and down the side of the building. Gold furnishings line the windowsills, giving the entire inside a healthy, rich feeling. In the center, a magnificent golden statue of a phoenix stands over a water fountain. In front of it, hanging from the ceiling, is what looks to Newt like a clock at first. But upon closer inspection, it isn't a clock. At least, not one that tells the time of day. Instead, its arrows point to one of 4 colored tabs, each one with a different label. There are green, low-level threat, blue, high-level threat, yellow, danger, orange, severe unexplained activity, and red, emergency. For the moment, the arrow sits somewhere in between blue and yellow. "What is that?" Newt says, pointing to the device. "That," Hans says, "is the Magical Exposure Threat Detector. It measures the potential threat of the magical world being revealed to the muggles in the US. "Huh. Interesting," Newt says, musing aloud to himself. He can't recall having seen anything quite like that during his time in the British Ministry of Magic. But then he reminds himself of the fact that Americans are far more sensitive about exposure, due to a breach in the International Statute of Secrecy nearly a century earlier. As they make their way further inside, Newt sees a number of tubes running along the walls. He squints his eyes as he sees little forms moving through the tubes all around him. By the foot of the stairs sits a small, lanky-looking creature with large, lemur-like eyes and sharply pointed nose. It is dressed solely in an old potato sack. It sits on a stool in front of a pedal-operated feather duster. Occasionally, passing witches or wizards stop by him and hand over their wands. After giving him a good dusting, the elf hands the wand back to the owner, gesturing for the next in line to come forth. Hans stops by the door to the elevator. "Well, this is where I leave you. I'm going to get some lunch while you get everything sorted out," he says, pointing to a nearby shop. "Come find me when you're finished." Newt nods. "Will do," and then he presses the button on the wall to go up. After a few minutes, the elevator door opens. Inside, there is no one but a short, squat figure with beady black eyes and long, thin, grasping fingers. He looks at Newt and says, "Where you going, Mac?" Stepping into the elevator, Newt replies, "Department of Magical Security, please." "Sure thing," the goblin says, using a cane to point to the button labeled 7. The doors shut, and Newt feels the sudden jerk of the elevator as it lurches upward. Just a few seconds later, the doors open once more. Newt steps out before a pair of older-looking witches take his place. The elevator leads directly into the department's reception office, where a young witch wearing a pink cardigan sits, fiddling with her quill. When she sees him, she says, "Good morning. How can I help you?" in a very thick New York accent. "Good morning," Newt says cheerfully. "I have an appointment with Mr. Percival Graves for 11:30. "Sure thing, hon," she says. "Name?" "Newton Scamander." She dips her quill in a bottle of ink and scribbles down a note on a bit of parchment. When she finishes, she taps the note with her wand, and it folds itself into the shape of a mouse. The paper mouse scurries off the top of her desk and crawls into one of the tubes that Newt had observed earlier. "He shall be with you in just a moment," the witch says. "Feel free to take a seat." Not wanting to seem rude, Newt accepts her offer, planting himself on one of the chairs by the wall. He stares at the collection of old magazines lying carelessly on the table in front of him. He spends an inordinate amount of time contemplating whether or not to pick one up and flip through its pages. None of them have subjects that are of particular interest to him. Newt spends so much time debating with himself about whether to pick up one of the magazines that the door opposite him opens before he reaches a decision. The wizard takes a look at Newt and says, "Mr. Graves will see you now." "Oh, good," Newt says, getting to his feet and picking up his suitcase. He follows the man into the Department of Magical Security, where dozens of witches and wizards are hard at work. Most of them are filling out vast quantities of paperwork, and Newt spies many of the paper-folded mice running around the office. They move through a hallway on the far side, and Newt sees a line of prison bars with some rather unsavory characters staring through them. At the opposite end of the hall is a door marked with gold sign plate. Percival Graves, Head Auror, Head of the Department of Magical Security. The wizard knocks on the door, which opens not a second later of its own accord. He gestures for Newt to enter, and Newt obeys silently. The office is considerably spacious, lined with a number of dark detecting devices and wanted posters glaring at Newt as he enters. Opposite the door is a wide oak desk, behind which sits a tall, thin man. His black hair is mostly shaven along the sides, but is slicked back sharply across the top. He looks up at Newt with cold, penetrating black eyes that sit beneath a somehow sorrow-looking brow. "Well, well," he says with mild interest. "Mr. Scamander, we meet at last. Please, take a seat." Newt follows Graves' direction, pulling up a chair in front of the desk. "It's good to finally make your acquaintance," Newt says, his voice feeling louder than usual in the office. "How was your journey?" Graves says, putting down his quill and folding his hands on his desk. Newt sighs. "Long, more than anything," he says with a meek smile. "A shame one can't just apparate from one side of the world to the other, eh?" Graves shrugs. "The world is an imperfect place, Mr. Scamander. Which is why you and I have to meet in the first place." True, Newt says, nodding. "I have all the forms, if you'd like to take a look at them." "If you please." Newt picks up his case. "Do you mind?" he asks Graves, pointing to the desk. "Sure, no problem," Graves says, clearing a space for the case on his desk. Newt sets it down and presses his thumb against a latch on the right side that reads, "Muggleworthy." He pushes downward, pushing the latch back into place. He then opens the suitcase normally, only instead of being filled with basic traveling amenities, there is nothing but dark, empty space. This pit extends down, much farther than one might otherwise expect, given the case's size. Stepping back from the case, Newt pulls out his wand and says, "Accio registration files." Just a few moments later, a folder flies out of the open case and into Newt's left hand. There you are, he says, handing the files to Graves. Thank you, Graves says, taking the folder in hand and opening it up. Now, I just need you to sign this form declaring that everything in this folder is true to the best of your knowledge, and that any falsified information will result in your being prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. All right, Newt says, scribbling his signature onto the parchment. Graves begins to finger through the file, glancing casually at all the information. Then he suddenly stops. He pulls out a single piece of parchment, eyeing it with keen interest. He lets out a low whistle. This is the most up-to-date list of everything inside? That's correct, yes, Newt says stiffly. As Graves says nothing, his eyes move further down the list, until he reaches about halfway down. Then his brow furrows. Something wrong? Newt asks, leaning in. This one here, the Nundu, is that how you say it? Graves asks tentatively. When Newt nods, Graves continues. The Nundu seems to have a lot of extra security precautions attached to it. Any particular reason for that? Newt gulps and gives a small smile. Yes. Yes, the Nundu is by far the most dangerous creature I have in this case. Really? Graves says, his eyebrows rising slightly. Well, how dangerous is it? Well, Newt says, looking to one side. See, for reference sake, it usually takes about 10 or so wizards to bring down the larger, more aggressive dragon species, whereas there's never been a record of a Nundu being subdued by any less than 100 skilled wizards and witches working together. Good God, Graves says with a hint of awe in his voice. What makes them so dangerous? Well, quite a few things, actually. They are extremely large, powerful creatures standing about 35 feet tall at the shoulder and stretching over 75 feet long from nose to tail. Essentially, they're a species of gigantic big cat, something like a leopard. Their skin is powerfully magically resistant to even the strongest enchantments. They move silently despite their size, but by far the most dangerous thing about them is their breath. Nundu breath is insanely toxic and infectious. Anyone who breathes even a single whiff will die a slow, agonizing death over the course of several days. The disease causes mass hemorrhaging throughout the entire body. The more Newt speaks, the more enthused he becomes, which in turn causes him to become more relaxed and comfortable. Graves pauses for a moment, taking all this in. Finally, he speaks. Wait a minute, if it takes 100 wizards to kill this thing, how did you get it inside this case? Well, I didn't do it alone, if that's what you're asking, Newt says. First off, the Nundu wasn't quite fully grown yet. It was a mature adolescent at the time. It had been terrorizing a town in northern Tanzania, and the local wizards there were looking for recruits to help take care of it. Having never seen a live Nundu before, I saw it as the opportunity of a lifetime. I mean, when will I ever get a kind of chance like this again? So little is known about Nundus, for obvious reasons. I couldn't pass it up. But about 120 of us total, give or take. We'd finally managed to knock it out using a combination of atmospheric charms to dissipate its breath with the wind, and a hell of a lot of well-placed and well-timed stunning spells. Once it was unconscious, I asked for help carrying it into my case. Ever since then, I mostly keep him asleep by feeding him meat infused with draughts of living death. He's never seen me before. I levitate his food in from outside the walls of his paddock, that I clean while he's sleeping. Because he's so powerful, I have to keep reapplying the enchantments that surround his enclosure every day. That's pretty impressive, Graves says, nodding his head slowly, rocking back in his chair. How long have you had him? Newt takes a moment to think, looking up at the ceiling as he does. Oh, I'd say about a year and a half, 2 years, something along those lines. Has he gotten much bigger? Newt nods. Oh yes, he should be fully grown by now. Last I checked he was 31 feet tall, 68 feet long, and weighed about 14 tons. Damn, Graves says, giving a small chuckle. And all that time not a single incident. Not one, Newt says, sitting up slightly. Well, let's hope your track record keeps going, Graves says, picking up his wand and lightly tapping it on his knuckles. Newt gives him a curious look, and he replies, knock on wood. When Newt still fails to register, he says, You never heard that saying? I think it might actually be touchwood in the UK, Newt says with a smile. But, and he picks up his wand as well, when in Rome, eh? And he, too, taps his wand lightly on his knuckles. Picking up his quill and dipping it in ink, Graves asked, Are there any other creatures in here that you might consider to be of special concern? A fair few, Newt says. Now, apart from the Nundu, the ones you should be most concerned about are the Acromantula, the three dragons, the Lethofold, and the Quintaped. I do have one Chimera in there, but it's just a cub at the moment, so not really dangerous yet. Yeah, I'm not exactly as, learned as you are on all this. Can you give me a few notes on what to look for? I mean, I should be okay with the dragons, but... Oh, certainly, Newt says. Let's see. Well, the Acromantula is a spider about the size of an automobile. The Lethofold, it's a bit hard to describe. I suppose it looks most like a living shadow or black cloak more than anything. As for the Quintaped, and Newt's cheeks suddenly turn a vivid red. Well, let's say that the Quintaped is the one that might make you blush. Huh, Graves says, jotting down the notes on a scrap of parchment. All right then, is that it? Those are the most dangerous ones, yeah, Newt says. Some, like the Rampants, the Graphorns, or the T-bow, can also be, we'll say, bothersome, but nothing any skilled wizard can't handle. Okay, Graves says, getting to his feet. So I received these notes from the Beast Division of the Body for the Protection of Magical Species that should enable me to do a head count of everything in there. It's a long list, so it could take a while. Have you checked in at the Wand Permit office yet? No, I just got in about an hour ago, Newt says. Why don't you get everything all set there? Come back when you're done, and hopefully I'll be finished by then, Graves suggests. Sounds like a fair plan, Newt says, getting to his feet as well. So I suppose I'll see you later then? Graves nods. Of course. Newt bows his head and leaves the magical security department. Another quick trip in the elevator finds him on the -8th floor, where the Wand Permit office is located. It's not quite as busy as Newt is expecting, with only a few others there in the waiting room. There's no secretary. Instead, a bronze bust of a frizzy-haired elderly wizard stands by the door. Whenever someone leaves the office, the bust looks at someone in the waiting room and calls out to them in a hoarse voice. Hey you, the pink hat! You're next! You're up, Baldy! Hey you, the chin! Get in there! It says to Newt. I'll get polished, Newt says back to the bronze bust as he enters the main office. To his surprise, there's only one witch on duty. As he takes a seat in front of her desk, Newt can't help but be subtly struck by her beauty. Dark eyes, dark hair, and modest pink lips. On the whole, her face is completely unembellished by any makeup. Newt is so taken with her that he almost misses her simple greeting. Good afternoon. Yes, afternoon, he says, remembering where he is. Can I see your passport, please? She says. He hands her the same passport he handed to the customs agent back at the harbor, but instead of opening the front, she turns it around and flips it, opening the back cover. Inside is an entirely different passport with entirely different information, and with a photo ID that moves in its frame. Visiting from England? She asks. Well, that's where I'm from, Newt says, but I'm actually traveling from Guinea in West Africa. Her eyes go slightly wide. That's quite a journey. What brought you there? Fupas, mostly, Newt says happily. Seeing the confused look on her face, he says, They're a group of African birds in the same family as turacos. I've actually been travelling all over the world for the past 3 years, studying magical animals and compiling a collection of notes on them in order to publish a book. The witch's face seems to come to life. Well, that's certainly different, she says with a wide grin. Not exactly the tourists and businessmen I usually get, that's for sure. What's the book called? Haven't decided yet, Newt says. All I know is that I wanted to include the phrase fantastic beasts. Fantastic beasts, the witch repeats. Why's that? Well, Newt says, laughing a little, it's sort of complicated. He pauses, giving her the opportunity to back out. But when she gives him an inquisitive look, he presses on. You see, it all goes back to the father of magizoology, Traiton Cuvier. He was the first to establish a definitive method of separating magical from non-magical creatures in 1717. Yet ironically, he was a firm believer that magical and non-magical creatures were fundamentally the same, and that one couldn't understand magical animals without understanding non-magical animals as well. Cuvier started the tradition of following the findings of Muggle naturalists in order to inform our knowledge of magical creatures. Now, unfortunately, my publishers have been, let's say, reluctant to include the importance of Muggle contribution to magizoology. I've tried fighting them on it, but they won't budge. So Fantastic Beasts is a sort of subtle nod to the place that many of these creatures exist in the Muggle world, the world of fantasy. Oh, okay. It's kind of clever, she nods, understanding just enough to make her comment genuine. What kind of creatures have you been studying? Any I might know? All depends on what you know, Newt says with a small shrug. I've been studying dragons, chimeras, trolls, fairies, griffins, pixies. Of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Wow, she says almost reverently as she places her chin on her hand. Sounds exciting. What brings you to New York, then? We don't have a lot of dragons running around Manhattan. In fact, beast ownership is banned in the U.S. Just to stop, Newt says. I have to register a particular piece of contraband with the U.S. Department of Magical Security before I can be let into the country. After that, though, it's off to Alabama to study clabberts. Wait, contraband, she says, getting caught on that part of Newt's statement. What's that mean? Well, Newt says, rubbing the back of his head, throughout my travels I have collected a number of live specimens to study. I keep them with me in a dimensionally transcendent suitcase. That is to say, a suitcase that's bigger on the inside. Wait, back up a sec, she says, waving her hands slightly. You mean to say that you brought a suitcase full of magical creatures into the middle of the wizarding capital of the United States of America? Essentially, yes, Newt says. The witch makes a noise that sounds somewhere between a cough and a laugh. That's illegal, first and foremost. There's got to be at least 15 laws, federal, state, local, and international, that would violate. Well, I had to get special permission from the MACUSA. I used to work in the British Ministry of Magic Department for the regulation and control of magical creatures. I used some of my old ministry contacts to get legal jurisdiction to bring the creatures into the country. She twists her hand, seemingly confounded. You must have had to pull a lot of strings. U.S. laws on these sorts of things are insanely strict, especially under Graves. I know, But he stops, suddenly noticing something unusual. You know, if it's not too bold to say, you seem exceptionally knowledgeable on U.S. law enforcement for someone from the Wand Permit Office. The excited look on the witch's face falls, and her eyes flicker down to her desk. Oh, it's just that I actually used to work in the Magical Security Department. I'm an Auror by training. Now Newt's eyes widen. An Auror? Blimey, you can't say I've met many Aurors, let alone American Aurors. Well, ex-Auror, remember, she says, gesturing to the office. At this moment, Newt begins to feel something stirring in the inside of his coat pocket. Before he can reach up to stop it, something crawls out of the pocket and down his arm to the table. It is about 5 inches tall, and at first looks like a small man made of twigs. but a closer inspection reveals it to be a strange grasshopper standing perfectly balanced on its two back legs. The outer surface of its exoskeleton has the color and texture of aged bark, and small stick-like growths protrude from certain points along its body. On its two twitching antennae, it appears to have two green leaves attached to the very tips. Each of its 4 free limbs is tipped in a savagely curved claw. At the sight of the small wooden insect, the woman lets out a surprised gasp, while Newt simply rolls his eyes and groans. "Pickett!" he scolds the creature accusingly. "I told you to stay inside." He reaches out to pick it up, wrapping his fingers around its thorax. The creature, Pickett, is having none of this, and slashes at Newt's skin with its claws. "Ah, yowza!" Newt cries out, dropping Pickett back onto the table. It walks in an almost bird-like fashion toward the woman, who backs away in her chair. "What the hell is that?" she asks. "Don't worry, it's all right, it's just a bowtruckle." "A what?" she asks. "A bowtruckle, highly derived bipedal grasshoppers that guard trees. It's perfectly fine, they're completely harmless." "Harmless," she says disbelievingly, looking at the scratches on Newt's hand. "Well, I mean, all right, they have been known to gouge people's eyes out on occasion, but only when they feel threatened," he adds quickly. Pickett, the bowtruckle, walks to the very edge of the desk, seemingly staring at the woman, its leaf-like antennae twitching slightly with interest. "What does it want with me?" she asks. Newt says, looking contemplatively at the bowtruckle. "Oh, now that's certainly interesting." "What?" she asks. "Pickett's a wise beast. She only goes to those who feel pain," Newt says quietly, moving his eyes to the witch. "But she begins before pausing. Looking into the inquisitive little eyes of the bowtruckle, she relaxes and says in a low voice, "Well, I've seen better days, I suppose. I mean, I certainly don't want to pressure you into saying something you're not comfortable with," Newt says, putting up his hands. No, it's just..." And she lets out a heavy sigh. "I didn't end up at the Want Permit office by choice." "You don't say," Newt says, folding his hands. "What happened?" The witch looks down. It looks as if she's debating with herself about what to say and how much. When she finally decides, she looks back at Newt and says, "Grindelwald." Newt looks taken aback. "I'm sorry?" "Grindelwald. You know Gellert Grindelwald, the Dark Wizard?" she says. Newt nods. "Yes, I know who he is, but what does he have to do with you? Surely he's not here in New York." She shakes her head. No, last I checked he was hiding somewhere in Eastern Europe, most likely in Albania. But his ideas have started making their way here to the U.S. During my last few months as an Aur, I found dozens of criminals in the possession of Grindelwald's propaganda, pamphlets, articles, his autobiography, etc. At the same time, we saw a noticeable rise in the increase of attacks on Moggots. "On what?" Newt asks. "Moggots," she says very plainly. "You know, non-magical people." "Oh, sorry, we call them muggles back in the UK, Newt says. "Ah, okay," she says, nodding. "Well, anyway, there's been an increase in the unprovoked attacks on them over the last several months. Now, magical and non-magical relations have never been stellar here in the US, but these attacks have been getting not only more frequent, but more malicious as well." "What do you mean?" She pauses. With a gulp, she continues. "Well, I don't think the details are necessary, but let's just say we don't always find the victims all in the same place." "Dear," Newt says, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Now, do you think these attacks are all connected? Are they organized by single movement?" "See, that's what I thought," she says, pointing at him. "But I looked into it on my own, and as far as I could tell, they were all isolated incidents. Nonetheless, though, organized or not, there's growing anti-Moggot sentiment growing right here in the capital. Too much more, and it could explode into a catastrophe." "What did you do?" Newt says, curious as to what this has to do with the woman being demoted. She slumps slightly at his words. I went to my supervisor about all this. You mean Percival Graves? Newt asks. That's right, she says with a single nod. How'd you know? I just came from his office, Newt says. I had to leave my case with him for inspection and registration. But anyway, you were saying? Yes, right, well, I went to him about it, but he wouldn't listen to me. He didn't seem to think it was very important, said I was seeing things that weren't there, even when I showed him the Grindelwald propaganda. He waited it off, saying there were still plenty of criminal activity going on in the city with no ties to Grindelwald. An unfortunate disagreement, Newt says, but a difference of opinion hardly seems a good reason for being sacked. She grimaces. Well, 4 months back, I got a tip-off from one of my informants about an impending attack. A dark wizard, purportedly connected to Grindelwald, was planning an attack on Times Square. I went to Graves about it, but as usual he just ignored me. He said that he wasn't going to launch a major countermeasure on the basis of a hunch, she says with a scoff. Pfft, never mind, this same informant has helped me track down dozens of perps in the past. So what did you do? Newt says, leaning forward slightly. She actively avoids his eyes as she continues. Graves had me patrolling 24th Street, but about halfway through my shift, I headed over to Times Square. I kept my eyes out for any sign of suspicious activity, but after a couple hours I figured it must have been a bust. She pauses again, looking at the bipedal grasshopper, still eyeing her intently. When I went back to my post, I discovered a building on fire. Turns out that while I was gone, a pair of wizards had broken into an apothecary hidden in the basement of an apartment building. There was an incursion between the thieves and the shopkeep, which ultimately started the fire. By the time it was eventually put out, 17 people lost their lives. 3 wizards and 14 maggots, including an infant. She finishes with a voice dripping with shame. Oh, Newt says, simply lowering his gaze. I'm very sorry. She says nothing at first. To be honest, I'm actually lucky to even have this job. Graves was furious, of course, as anyone would be. If not for my otherwise impeccable track record, I'd probably be working as a maggot grocer. Newt gives a weak laugh. Got to look at that bright side, eh? She gives him a small smile. It makes it easier. It's not exactly hard work down here. And the money isn't terrible. The money's never really been an issue. I share an apartment with my sister. Hey, what does she do? He asks. She's a secretary in the Magical Transportation Administration. She's completely wasted there, though, and she's a natural-born legilimens. She does it without even thinking. I had to learn occlumency when I was 7 just to keep her from tattling on me constantly. Even then, she's only gotten better with age. I have to keep actively training myself to shut her out, which can be exhausting at times. Newt looks impressed. My. Never known a legilimens that talented. I have a cousin who's pretty good at it, but he has to use a wand. She laughs a little. Quinny's been eavesdropping on thoughts before she could even hold a wand. She was the biggest gossip Ilvermorny had ever known. Newt laughs as well. I don't think I got your name. Oh, Tina. Tina Goldstein. Newt reaches out and offers her his right hand. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Goldstein. Likewise, she says, shaking his hand firmly. Hey, Goldstein! A voice shouts from behind the door. Newt recognizes it as the tactless Bust. Hurry it up! Shut up! She shouts back. Looking back at Newt, she says, Sorry about him. He's just cranky because he was sculpted from a later point in his life. Newt sniggers softly. Guess he misses his hair. But he's right. We probably should finish up here, she says. May I see your wand, please? Newt obliges, pulling out his wand and handing it over. You're British, so this'll be an Ollivander wand, correct? Newt nods. She examines it closely, running her fingers over the smooth wooden surface. Shaft is ash, handle is lime. What is this on the inside of the handle? A mother of pearl, Newt says. Huh, that's new, she says with mild surprise. What's the core? A mixture of crushed bones, seashells, and fossils from Dorset, Newt says. Rather odd for an Ollivander wand, Tina says. Usually you'd find something like that from Grigorovich or Ermion. Newt shrugs. Ollivander seemed to think the exception was appropriate. Now I just need you to sign here, she says, sliding a form past the bowtruckle in front of Newt. And initial here, here, and here, she says, making a few lines on the parchment with her quill before handing it back to Newt, who signs quickly. And lastly, the practical exam. She picks up her wand and waves it 2 times. In the corner of the room, a stuffed dummy springs to life and strides over to them, waving at Newt and Tina. This is Fred, Tina says. I just need you to perform 3 basic enchantments on Fred, and you'll be all set. All right, Newt says, standing up and holding his wand. What sort of enchantments? I'd like you to perform a levitation charm, a leg locker curse, and a vanishing spell. Verbally, if you please, she says, picking up a clipboard. Very well, Newt says confidently. He clears his throat and says, Wingardium Leviosa. Fred is lifted slightly off his feet and begins floating upwards like a balloon. Tina makes a note as Fred regains his weight and returns to the ground. Next, Newt says, Locomotor Mortis, and Fred's ankles shoot toward each other. Fred has to jump with his legs stuck together in order to stay on his feet, and Tina makes another note. Lastly, as Tina frees Fred's legs, Newt says, Evanesca. Fred begins to fade from view until he has vanished completely. Tina waves her own wand, returning Fred into view, and he takes his place in the corner of the room, once more falling limp. Perfect, Tina says, giving one last scribble on the parchment. Your wand is officially registered for legal use in the United States of America, she says, tapping the parchment with her wand, which splits like a cell into 2 identical copies. She hands one to Newt and says, Good luck with your book, Mr. Scamander. Thank you very much, Ms. Goldstein, Newt says, taking his copy and returning her wide smile. Before leaving her office, he goes over to the desk and picks up the wood-like insect by the thorax. Back in you go, he says, setting her in the coat pocket. As he leaves her office, the bust of the cantankerous wizard gives him a nasty look, but otherwise says nothing to him, instead proceeding to call out the next in line, a very pregnant witch. Once more, Newt heads up in the elevator to the Department of Magical Security. Not long after that, Graves meets him in the reception office, with his suitcase hanging from his left hand. Mr. Scamander, Graves says with a nod to Newt. Newt returns the nod and says, How's everything look? Everything looks fine, just fine, he says with a smile, handing over the suitcase back to Newt. All the creatures are accounted for, and all the security enchantments have been tested. There should be no problems. Thank you, Newt says. He's about to bid Graves good day when he suddenly remembers Tina and her experiences with Graves. For a moment he's tempted to mention her to him as if to get a second opinion, but remembering how much he enjoyed their conversation and knowing that Graves most likely had nothing nice to say about her, he decided against it. Good day to you, Mr. Graves. And the same to you, Mr. Scamander, Graves says. Enjoy your stay in the U.S. Newt finds Hans in the shop, sipping coffee and reading a copy of a newspaper entitled The New York Ghost. How was everything? Hans asks as Newt takes his seat. Smooth as a mooncalf, Newt says. Glancing at the newspaper, he catches sight of a few headlines. Soccer, the Mocket's Quidditch, was one of the headlines, and it was accompanied by a moving black-and-white photograph of several men kicking a ball the size of a quaffle from one to the other. Other headlines included, Ilvermorny receives new wandmaker, Pickery's approval ratings bounce back after Gringotts fiasco, and Mogget killing spree continues, the killing curse suspected. The last headline catches Newt's attention. Thinking back to his conversation with Tina, he leans in and asks in a quiet voice, Hans, what's the last you heard of Grindelwald? Hans looks away from his paper and gives Newt a mildly surprised look. Grindelwald? Haven't heard anything about him since his attack in Berlin. Why? I met a witch in the Wand Permit office, Newt says. She used to be an Auror, and she seems to think that Grindelwald's influence is spreading here to the US. Really? Hans says with an interested look. I mean, I suppose it's possible. I don't pay much attention to the news, so I guess she'd know more than I would. Strange, Newt says absent-mindedly. His thoughts are interrupted by a growling from his stomach, and he is suddenly hit with an intense hunger. Oh dear, just realized I haven't eaten since last night. Come on, let's get back to my place. Let's not bother with this shop. I'll cook you a proper meal, Hans says, folding up the newspaper and getting to his feet. Here, hold my hand. Newt obeys, and the moment that their hands touch, a loud crack splits the air, and Newt feels his body being forcibly pulled forward, the world around him spinning wildly into a blur of shapes and colors. Not a few seconds later, he and Hans are standing in the middle of a modest apartment, about 3 floors up if the view from the window is any indication. Nice place. Hans says with a shrug. Not much, but it's home. You'll have to sleep on the couch, I'm afraid. Only have the 1 bedroom. He leads Newt into the living room, where the single couch sits up against the wall. Hans waves his wand, and the cushions fly out, a mattress folding out into the room supported by steel frames. Another few flicks of his wand, and Hans conjures several sheets, a blanket, and 2 pillows. Compared to sleeping in the middle of the Bornean jungle, I'm sure I'll be just fine, Newt says, setting his suitcase on the bed. What would you like for lunch? Hans asks, looking in his cupboards. Soup? Sandwich, maybe? Newt follows him into the kitchen, his eyes drawn to the refrigerator. What is this? He asks, running his hand over the 6-foot-high box. Oh, that's called a refrigerator. Very handy-muggle device. Runs on electricity, you know. Keeps food fresh for days, weeks, even months sometimes. Newt opens the door and sees that it is filled with food. Milk, cheese, vegetables, and a few different kinds of meat. You're right, that is handy, Newt says, genuinely impressed with the machine. Muggle inventiveness never ceases to amaze me. So, what would you like to eat? Hans asks again. Well, Newt says, looking in the fridge, I see some roast beef in here. Say no more, Hans says, waving his wand, the meat soaring from the fridge to his countertop. Another flick of his wand, and the oven switches on. At that moment, there's a knock on the apartment front door. Wand away, Hans orders Newt in a whisper, following his own direction. He moves to the front door, glancing out of the peephole. A smile spreads over his face. Oh, it's my neighbor, Mr. Kowalski. He opens the door, and just outside the threshold stands a short, portly gentleman with curly hair and a thin black mustache. Good afternoon, Mr. Venneberg, he says with a soft voice and a warm smile. I didn't hear you come in. Oh, I just got back from picking up my friend at the harbour, Hans says, motioning toward Newt. Newt moves to the doorway and extends his hand in a friendly gesture. Hello there, Newt's commander. Ah, English, huh? Mr. Kowalski says, taking Newt's hand in his own. He recognizes Newt's accent, while he speaks with a pronounced New York accent himself. That's right, Newt says. What are you doing in New York? Mr. Kowalski asks. Just stopping by, visiting Hans here, Newt says. I'm actually currently working on a book about animals, and have come to the US to do some field work. Sounds exciting, Mr. Kowalski says. What kind of animals? Oh, all kinds, really, Newt says. I've actually been traveling the world for the past couple of years now, studying many different kinds of animals. Wow, sounds incredible, Mr. Kowalski says with an almost childlike sense of wonder. Do you have a favorite animal? You know, it's funny but before he can finish, Hans returns from the kitchen holding 2 glasses of beer. Careful drink, he says, offering them to Newt and Miss Kowalski. Oh, sure, thanks, Mr. Kowalski says, taking the glass. Feel free to come in. Take a seat, Hans says, gesturing to the free chairs in the living room. Mr. Kowalski steps into the room. It is only then that Newt sees that Mr. Kowalski is carrying a suitcase, not unlike his own. What do you have in there? Newt asks. Oh yeah, actually, Mr. Kowalski begins, taking a seat and setting his suitcase on his lap. I was actually wondering if Mr. Vandenberg wanted to take any of these pastries, he says, pointing to the many golden doughnuts, croissants, and punchkis inside. Oh my word, Newt says, leaning in to take a closer look. Those look fantastic. May I take one? Please do, Mr. Kowalski says excitedly. Here, take a punchki. They're my grandmother's recipe. He hands one of the round, sugar-coated pastries to Newt, who takes it eagerly. Just moments after taking his first bite, Newt's face scrunches up and he sinks into a nearby chair. Oh my goodness. That is fantastic, he says, still chewing. Did you make this? Yeah, I did, Mr. Kowalski says, blushing slightly and smiling. I love to cook, and bake, and all that. Newt finishes the punchki and says, It's clear to see why. If I could make anything even half that delicious, I'd love to bake too. That's awfully nice of you, Mr. Scamander, Mr. Kowalski says. Are you a chef? Newt says, helping himself to a croissant. You know, it's funny you should mention that, Mr. Kowalski says, because I actually just got back from the bank today. See, I really want to open up a bakery, you know? That's like my dream. So I went to try to get a loan to open up my own bakery. At this point, Mr. Kowalski's otherwise bright expression falters a little. How did it go? Newt asks. Mr. Kowalski scoffs and says, I didn't get the loan. And he shrugs, taking out a donut and taking a bite. I've got no collateral. Oh. I'm very sorry to hear that, Newt says. Yeah. You know, they say that there are machines now that make hundreds of pastries in an hour. Really? Newt says, amazed. Yeah, Mr. Kowalski says. But those machines, they just don't got the heart, you know? Now people make pastries to make each other feel happy. Machines don't know how to make people happy. Interesting, Newt says, listening intently to Mr. Kowalski. So essentially you're saying it's not about how many pastries you can make, it's about how good they make people feel. Yeah, exactly, Mr. Kowalski says, pointing at Newt. At least somebody gets it. So what will you do now that you didn't get your loan? Newt asks. Mr. Kowalski lets out a long sigh. Well, I just gotta go back to work for now. I work in a canning factory. What's a canning factory? Newt asks, perfectly innocently. Mr. Kowalski gives him an odd look. You know, like where they can food? When Newt still looks confused, he adds, like where they put food into tin cans? Oh, yes, right, I see, Newt says, finally understanding. How do you like it there? Mr. Kowalski gives a single humorless chuckle. How do I like it there? I don't like it there. That's how I like it there. I'm dying there, you know. Everyone's dying there. Crushes the life right out of you. You know, it's the same thing day in, day out, same monotonous, tedious work for hours on end. Sounds quite terrible, Newt says sympathetically. I can never do that. Neither can I, Mr. Kowalski says. That's why I gotta get out of there. When did you learn to cook? Newt asks. Well, my grandmother mostly, Mr. Kowalski says. Her meals were the highlight of every holiday growing up. Family would come all the way from Ohio just to have some of her chicken or one of her punchkis. I remember just how happy everyone was to sit down and enjoy a great meal like that. My grandmother used to tell me that there was no greater joy in all the world than to make other people happy. She sounds like a wonderful woman, Newt says, smiling warmly. Thank you, Mrs. Scamander. I appreciate that, Mr. Kowalski says, offering him another punchki, which Newt gladly accepts. He finishes his beer and sets the glass down on the table. Anyway, I just wanted to stop by and offer you guys some treats. Well, it was lovely meeting you, Newt says, and thank you very much for these exquisite pastries." "Too kind, Mr. Scamander," Mr. Kowalski says. "Good luck with your book." "Thanks very much. Good day to you," Newt says with a nod. When Kowalski leaves through the door, Newt moves to close it, and then joins Hans in the kitchen. "He seems like a rather lovely man." "Oh, yes, quite a friendly fellow," Hans says, still working on the roast beef. "Brings me my Muggle mail from my mailbox downstairs sometimes. I overheard you two talking just now. I had no idea he wanted to open up a bakery." "I certainly hope he gets his loan," Newt says, glancing back at the door. "I haven't had anything that tasty in months." Within a few minutes, the roast beef is ready, and the two wizards sit down for a hearty lunch. Newt savors the warm, succulent meat. Years in the field have given him a very utilitarian perspective on food, and he rarely thinks of the action of eating as anything more than a basic necessity for survival. Good meals such as these are a welcome reminder that there is a world of food beyond wild mushrooms, raw meat, and beetle grubs. The rest of the night is spent catching up with each other, having not seen one another in nearly 6 years. Most of this consists of Newt recounting some of his adventures abroad, observing and interacting with magical creatures. Some of the highlights are a Jarvey that called Newt a miserable, bony-assed sod, a Kappa that nearly killed Newt while he was sleeping in the wilds of Japan, and a close encounter with a particularly aggressive river troll. The night finally ends with Newt descending into his case and giving all of its inhabitants their dinner, a task that takes all of 2 hours to fully complete. When Hans sees him emerge from the case once more, he's covered in dirt, smelling surprisingly ripe, and carrying a bucket full of disgusting-smelling waste. Newt walks out to the fire escape and dumps the bucket out into the adjacent alleyway. Fortunately, there is no one but a small flock of pigeons to observe this action. A quick wash in the bathroom solves that problem, and Newt is soon ready for a well-earned night's sleep. He crawls under the sheets of the fold-out sofa and plants his head firmly on the soft, feather-filled pillows. In no time at all, Newt is fast asleep.